founding documents. We got through the Civil War, the early days of Reconstruction in year 1. Year 2, we raced from Reconstruction, problem of emancipation, right through the Second World War, and this year we're really going to be focusing on the period 1945 to the present. The grant, as you know, is called Making Connections, Mississippi History as American History, and so we're looking at American history through the lens of Mississippi. And so when we looked at the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, for example, we looked very carefully at the problem of slavery. So not just the Declaration of Independence as a document that is still one of the most inspirational documents ever written, affirming the essential dignity and rights of an individual human being, but the fact that the person who wrote that was a slave owner, and what that told us and what that meant. Some of you will have been to Monticello with us and have seen sort of close at hand how that tension between slavery and freedom played out. We followed this through the Civil War. We followed this through Reconstruction, the onset of Jim Crow. This year in particular, I think our focus, at least in the presentations that I will be doing, is going to be even more Mississippi-centric than in the past. I've looked pretty carefully at the state standards, and as Mike and Whit mentions, the story of the Mississippi Freedom Movement, or if you will, the Civil Rights Movement, is really a central part of the state standards. And it's also, it seems to me, an extraordinarily rich opportunity for teaching, because the places that we're going to be talking about this year are where we are. And the opportunities you have to work with your students to actually have major movements in American history and have them go out and interview their grandmother because their grandmother participated in that. I think that's going to make a really unique year for us. In starting the day, I won't do this because it will take too much time, but I've now been teaching at universities for over 20 years, and most years I teach some course or other on the Civil Rights Movement. I've done that at Stanford, I've done that at Brown University, I've done that at Northwestern. So I'm teaching a pretty elite, if you will, or selective group of students. And I'm teaching students in a civil rights seminar who are upper class, usually history majors, who've chosen to take a course in the history of the Civil Rights Movement. So this is not a random sample of Americans, right? This is probably a group of young people who know as much or more about this movement as you could ever expect a group of Americans to know. And what I usually do to begin is and this is just a way of freaking them out. You can do this too with your students. They walk in the first day, I tell them to take out a piece of paper because they have a quiz. And even though they're accomplished Stanford seniors, they still have a little child inside them who starts saying, that's not fair, that's not fair. But what I then do is I give them a set of IDs. And I give them a series of names of people who we will be talking about and learning about over the course of the coming semester. And I keep a file of the results. And we don't really grade it. I say to them, look, I'm going to give you a name. If you could give me more than one sentence about that person, just raise your hand. In other words, if you know, you haven't just heard the name, but you actually know something. I've given that test at least 15 times, again, to this very select population. 20 names. Every year there are 3 who get 100% recognition. You tell me who they are. Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, Malcolm X. I have never once had another figure in that list get to 50%. Actually, Thurgood Marshall, head of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the lawyer who argued the Brown v. Board of Education case, later the first black Supreme Court Justice of the United States, in 2004 got to exactly 50%. And that was because it was the 50th anniversary of Brown v. Board, and you couldn't turn on your television without seeing it. Most of the people that I was interested in, that we're going to be talking about here in the Mississippi movement, people like Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer, Bob Moses, Stokely Carmichael, Andrew Goodman, Mickey Schwerner, James Chaney, and even working down from that to even less conspicuous figures like Amzie Moore, C. C.C. Bryant at McCollum, would get 0% or maybe one student per person. Now, my point here is not to cram you full of names of people. And I'm not suggesting that, on your test, you're going to have to do IDs of every one of these people. That would be a silly way for you to teach, certainly a silly way for us to learn together. My point simply is that that test and the results are indicative of something that's happened in our country around the issue of historical memory. That a movement that went on not just for 10 years or so, but for decades, some would say for over a century, that was concentrated not only in Montgomery or not even in the South, but all over the nation, has been distilled down in our imagination into a story of a few great charismatic leaders, with Martin Luther King as the star like Moses parting the water. We tell it as a simple morality tale. We tell it as a story of charismatic leaders. We focus on large-scale demonstrations in public space rather than what was essential in Mississippi, less conspicuous, slower, more patient community organizing of ordinary people. We tell it chiefly as a struggle over access, the right to share in public accommodations such as lunch counters and theaters and buses. And we tell it as a Southern movement, though the presence of Malcolm X is always a little confusing and most people don't know where to put him. And so, other than like putting a Malcolm poster on their wall, they usually don't include him when they're teaching the history of the Civil Rights Movement. Or if they do, they simply portray him as the kind of dark alternative to the nonviolent, uplifting, I have a dream ideology of Martin Luther King. Even those people who do get focused on Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, get flattened into cardboard cutout caricatures. I'm going to talk today about Rosa Parks and tell you things about Rosa Parks I suspect you don't know. King, who in some ways has become the symbol. I mean, they're just this year, as you know, in Washington, D.C., dedicated a memorial to Martin Luther King on the Mall in Washington, right across the tidal basin from Thomas Jefferson, interestingly enough. Even the King we get is flattened. There's very little in our textbooks, certainly in the memorial, certainly in the way that King is honored or talked about in our national holiday for him in February, about his opposition to Vietnam. And about the way in which he connected his opposition to Vietnam, the war in Vietnam, to the struggle for social justice in America. And so that every bomb dropped in Vietnam is exploding in one of our cities. We don't get that. We don't learn about one of King's most spectacular defeats when he went in 1966 and tried to organize around fair housing in Chicago. And the violence he confronted in Chicago. Martin Luther King, before his death, said he was scared twice in his life. One was in Philadelphia, Mississippi. The other was marching in Cicero, Illinois, outside of Chicago. We don't learn, as we go to the King Memorial in the Mall and see excerpts of the I Have a Dream speech, about the Poor People's Campaign that Martin Luther King was organizing at the end of his life when he was cut down. It was in that context where he said, we will be judged. And God will see us at judgment. And he will say, I do not know you, for I was hungry, and you fed me not. And Martin Luther King, who said, what's the use of being able to sit at the lunch counter if you don't have the money to buy a hamburger? The story I'm trying to suggest to you, the movement we're going to be talking about here, is more diffuse, more complicated, far longer, and more national, and even international, than the small little king-centric narrative that we usually tell as civil rights, which starts with Brown v. Board in 1954 and the Montgomery bus boycott in 55, and more or less ends with the assassination of Martin Luther King in 1968. What is most important in the current circumstances for us about that narrative is that it almost completely misses Mississippi. Martin Luther King didn't spend much time in Mississippi. Martin Luther King was not the face of the movement in Mississippi. The movement in Mississippi was composed of people most of us have never heard of. People who, strange as this may sound, were a lot like the students that you teach in your classroom. Illiterate people, sharecroppers, people who just weeks before they went down to the county courthouse and tried to register to vote weren't even aware that black people had a record. And yet, those people created a movement. Those local people, those local communities, created one of the most extraordinary popular movements in American history. My own experience of this is kind of interesting. You know, the very first time I was driving through Mississippi, actually I've been here once before, but when I was a kid. Driving through Mississippi after I was a professor, I was just driving from Memphis to New Orleans. And I saw the sign for Macomb, Mississippi. And I got off, and I drove around. Because I had read so much about Macomb, Mississippi. It bulked so large in my imagination as this place of struggle, a place that became, in the early 1960s, the so-called dynamite capital of Mississippi, because of the violence that was inflicted against civil rights workers. And it was only over time that I began to understand how little people in these communities, I mean, I'm coming from across the country to visit this place, how little people in these communities knew about this history. I had a very dramatic experience of this. I worked earlier in my career, about 10 years ago, in building a website of documents from the Mississippi Freedom Movement. And I remember the first time we ever displayed it was at a Black History Month event at Ole Miss. And it was there. I mean, again, these are kids who, they're Ole Miss students and they had come, so they were obviously interested in this. And they too had heard virtually nothing about what we were talking about. And in fact, I remember we then went on the web to look at the existing Mississippi State Standard to see what it included in history classes about civil rights. And it had exactly two things. One was Martin Luther King. And the other was, in case you didn't get the message the first time, nonviolence. That was all. It said nothing about Mississippi, nothing about SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which we'll talk about today, nothing about Freedom Summer, nothing about the things that we're going to be talking about this year. This is now beginning to change. Mississippi, I think it's fair to say, and there's going to be a lot of things that I'm going to say over the course of this year that are inescapably controversial, and I'm going to try to say them in a way as dispassionate and even-handed as I can. But I think it is fair to say that Mississippi, of all of the states in the Union, has had the hardest time coming to terms in the present, facing and talking about what happened here. If you go to Alabama, you can visit Montgomery, you can visit Birmingham, see massive civil rights museums. If you go to Selma, for God's sakes, it's a city, don't put this on the tape, right? That almost wouldn't exist if it were not for civil rights tourism. Hundreds of thousands of people a year walk across the Edmund Pettus Bridge.